Now, the British government is set to put forth a new proposals to quell public protests by giving police more power to prevent serious disruption. The government passed legislation to address the issue last year, but it is planning to go further with a new set of laws known as the Public Order Bill, which is being debated in Parliament. The government wants to amend the bill before it becomes law. That is in order to broaden the power of police to deal with demonstrators who block traffic or lock themselves to objects or buildings. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has defended the new proposal, saying protests by a small minority should not affect other citizens. Civil rights groups have, however, warned that the legislation would be against democracy if passed by Parliament. We're joined by Lembit, Opik, a former member of the British Parliament, joining us live from London. Mr. Opik, if you could please elaborate more on this new bill which is being debated in the Parliament, which clearly you don't need to be a genius to realize that it is against democracy and it is limiting civil rights.
Yeah, first of all, the reason for this is because particularly climate protesters have been gluing themselves to roads and causing a lot of disruption in the United Kingdom. And this has caused a public backlash, loss of patience, with a small number of essentially anarchists who've been causing these difficulties. Secondly, the government is responding by trying to toughen up the restrictions on who can demonstrate in what way. And they say it's necessary in order to make ordinary law-abiding people able to conduct their business in an ordinary law-abiding way. And then we get to the third point. The unfortunate unintended consequence of this is that it can limit legitimate demonstration by people who have a genuine grievance. All the time, when I was a member of Parliament and now, I hear ministers saying, well, we have to do this because this small minority of extremists or rebels is causing trouble for the great majority. And don't worry, we will not abuse these rules in future. But that's the problem. Governments are terrible in the United Kingdom at misusing these kinds of powers. For example, by restricting demonstrations against them. And that's where the dilemma lies here. I personally, if you were to ask me, agree that some of these people are treating the current laws with contempt and causing terrible disruption. But existing legislation to manage those extremists. We do not need to reduce the democratic right to demonstrate. And that's what this is going to do.
So, Mr. Opik, you just mentioned yourself that government says that it will promise not to abuse this type of legislation. But the question is, when was the last time the government kept its promises?
When it comes to demonstrations, they've been terrible. Let's go all the way back to the illegal war in Iraq. The British government was willing to invade a country with the United States on a false prospectus, on lies, basically. If you're willing to do that with all the problems which are continuing decades later in Iraq, then to act responsibly when there are inconvenient but legitimate demonstrations in the United Kingdom. So I even believe that some of the ministers may have a good intent. But this legislation doesn't disappear with them. It only takes one cynical minister, one embattled prime minister, to shut down demonstration in this country using this new legislation. And I stress again, they have the powers to do this now. They're not applying them. There are many examples of the police actually essentially colluding with the demonstrators, having a nice chat, trying to make them feel all right, when they could, if they were serious about this, stop the demonstrations in their tracks using existing legislation. And that's the worry. In summary, they don't need new legislation. They need to apply what they've got. And that makes one very suspicious about the underlying motives for these changes.
So how likely is this legislation to pass, to be passed by Parliament, and what would that spell for the future of people who have legitimate demands?
On the first point, I think it's very likely to pass in the House of Commons. That's the lower house, the elected members, because the party politics is important there. And you get a big majority for the Conservatives, and that will probably vote for it. In the House of Lords, that's the unelected house, ironically perhaps, they're more likely to defend democracy because they cannot be pushed around to the same extent because they don't have to get the support of parties to stay in the Lords. And then we get to the unknown, whether the House of Lords will win or whether the Commons will win. In terms of your second question, let me answer that in a general way. We have seen, and I've seen in the last 40 years I've been in politics, a continuous erosion of civil liberties in the United Kingdom, always with the best intention. I think this is quite possibly going to happen again. And eventually this country will turn around and realize it's lost the very freedoms it started wars to defend.
Thank you very much, Lembit. Opik, a former member of the British Parliament.